James Longman, thanks very much. Let's go to Washington right now. Chief White House Correspondent Cecilia Vega. And Cecilia, President Biden and our allies are doing more now to crack down on Russia.
Yeah, George, we in fact could be looking at some of the strictest sanctions in modern history. What they're doing right now has really been described as the financial nuclear weapon. So they're cutting off Russia from this SWIFT banking system. Essentially, it allows big banks, large banks to send international transactions. They're still working out the details, but essentially we could be talking about ultimately crushing Russia's ability to do so much of its business beyond its own borders. Perhaps even bigger than that, though, George, is this targeting of Russia's central bank. This is a really big deal because it's targeting this some $600 billion that Russia has set aside to sort of sanction-proof its economy. And on top of that, now listen to this, officials are talking about targeting some of the richest Russians, freezing their assets in the West. And they are being really explicit about this. They're saying they're going after their yachts, their mansions, their mega luxury apartments, even their ability to send their children to fancy colleges in the West. So really, we're seeing the West, this administration and its allies cast this really wide net, going after Putin himself, going after those close to him, but also, as James was just saying, really hitting the Russian economy so much that Putin could be facing some pretty serious political backlash there at home in Moscow. And the point right now, George, they're really trying to push Moscow to this point, almost looking at the Iran model, turning it into a huge pariah on the international stage.
More military aid for the Ukrainians as well.
Yeah, this is a really big deal. That new package, Ian mentioned $350 million in this latest package, $1 billion total overall in this crisis. Ukrainian leaders had been pleading for more weapons, particularly those that would allow them to target planes and helicopters, Russians in the sky. The U.S. had been hesitating to send these surface-to-air missiles, partly out of fear of provoking Russia. Certainly that changed. The big question this morning, though, is how they're going to get those weapons to Ukraine, given the situation there right now on the ground. And one other huge move to tell you about, George, Germany with a big reversing this policy to not send lethal aid to conflict zones. Right now, they are agreeing to help Ukraine with some big weapons. So that front line there, they're about to get a lot of firepower, George.
Cecilia Vega.
The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. Joe Biden has turned calm into chaos, competence into incompetence, stability into anarchy, and security into catastrophe. I stand as the only president of the 21st century on whose watch Russia did not invade another country.
Уважаемые коллеги, вы видите, что западные страны предпринимают не только недружественные действия в отношении нашей страны в экономической сфере, я имею в виду нелегитимные санкции, о которых все хорошо знают, но высшие должностные лица ведущих стран НАТО допускают и агрессивные высказывания в адрес нашей страны. Поэтому приказываю министру обороны и начальнику генерального штаба перевести силы сдерживания российской армии в особый режим несения боевого дежурства.
Meanwhile, China's foreign ministry opposes the sanctions against Russia, saying those measures cannot resolve the Ukrainian crisis. The Chinese embassy in Moscow has echoed remarks made by the Russian envoy to the UN in condemnation of the US.
Among the 248 armed conflicts that occurred in 153 regions across the world from 1945 to 2001, 201 were initiated by the U.S., accounting for 81% of the total number.
The Chinese embassy in Russia has posted a list of the armed conflicts the US has been involved in since World War II. You can see the names of cities and years where the armed conflicts took place, more than 80% of which, the Chinese embassy said, were initiated by the US. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson suggested that the US should ask itself who's been the aggressor in those conflicts. Meanwhile, Victor Gao, an international relations expert at China's Soochow University, warned that sanctions against Russia will be mutually destructive for the West.
China believes that Ukraine has been very much used by the United States and Western countries in attempting to recruit Ukraine into NATO, which is very, very aggressive as far as Russia is concerned, very destabilizing of peace and stability in that part of the world. Such sanctions will be very mutually destructive, mainly because Russia is a very, very important country in the world, politically, militarily, in terms of energy, economic relations of all kinds. And Russia is such an important and indispensable energy supplier to so many countries in Europe. So by taking out Russia from the SWIFT settlement system, for example, as well as making it almost impossible to Russia to deal with other countries in Europe in terms of trade, export, energy, businesses, etc., is very hurtful to Russian interest, of course, on the one hand, but it's very hurtful of the European interest. Who benefits from all this? I think the United States has an agenda to benefit hugely because they want to sell LNG to Europe countries, and they do not want to have European countries buy more and more of oil and natural gas from Russia, which is cheaper and which is more sustainable.
Western powers have announced their decision to penalise Moscow by disconnecting some Russian banks from the SWIFT money transfer system, the world's biggest mechanism for conducting international financial transactions. The EU Commission's president announced the measure in a statement.
We commit to ensuring that a certain number of Russian banks are removed from SWIFT. This will ensure that these banks are disconnected from the international financial system and harm their ability to operate globally. We will stop Putin from using his war chest. We will paralyze the assets of Russia's central bank. This will freeze its transactions, and it made it impossible for the central bank to liquidate assets.
Western powers have been clear that only certain Russian banks will be affected. Other measures include a crackdown on so-called golden passports, which is the sale of citizenship in Western countries for wealthy Russians. There is also to be a transatlantic task force set up to ensure the implementation of these measures. Now, Britain's Prime Minister says the removal of some Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system is just a stepping stone, with more sanctions yet to come.
We have taken decisive action tonight with our international partners to shut Russia out of the global financial system, including the important first step of ejecting Russian banks from SWIFT. We will keep working together to ensure Putin pays the price for his aggression.
The EU has also, in another move last evening, announced a ban on our channel RT and also Sputnik, the news agency, and subsidiary companies from broadcasting in the bloc, which received a swift response from our editor-in-chief. Margarita Simonian.
The peoples and entities that are going to be subject to restrictive measures, political figures who hold key role of the Putin system in Russia, both the ones who disseminate propaganda, propagandists, and military. We are going to ban Russia Today and Sputnik from broadcasting in the Union, because they are the champions of information manipulation.
The EU that for years has been telling the whole world how much they treasure and love freedom of speech, how they appreciate and love diversity of thoughts, diversity of news and information, today in response to the actions of Russia and Ukraine meant to protect Russian-speaking citizens there, the EU announced that we won't broadcast there anymore. What the President's decision to start the operation has to do with us is unclear. It's absolutely obvious that no matter whether we continue broadcasting or not, the operation would proceed. It's absolutely clear that it's just an excuse. They wanted to close us for a long time, but it would have looked bad in the eyes of their own citizens, our audience, because it's against freedom of speech anyway. And now a convenient excuse appeared, and they decided to get rid of the long-lasting, uncomfortable issue of us and our huge audience in this way. We'll find some other way to communicate with our audience for sure, without direct broadcasting. But the people of the European Union today can see how much that lauded talk of freedom of speech costs.
This is a very fluid situation, of course, but I suppose we should talk about us first, RT International. Your reaction to the news that the proposal is that it's taken off air in Europe?
Well, that's very sad because this was one of the few channels that Russia had to express its views and provide an alternative, one of many alternatives that are needed, to the party line that we heard from von der Leyen and we've heard from Washington. The public then is deprived of thinking matter. But I'm more concerned about the placing of the Russian nuclear and other strategic assets on full alert, because this takes us to the level of danger that we experienced in 1962 in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is not an unprecedented act for these systems to be activated, but it is a very worrisome development because it puts the fate of the world.
In practice, what does it actually mean?
It actually means that our leaders, or our pretended leaders in Europe and in Washington, have collective amnesia. Either that or they never studied history. Because as in the States, every December 7th is celebrated as Pearl Harbor Day, and everyone weeps for the losses and forgets entirely how and why Pearl Harbor came about. It came about from circumstances not so very different from what we're seeing today. It was the result of economic boycott and economic pain inflicted on Japan, which became intolerable, so that an economic war became a kinetic war. We are at that point today. And I think that it's time that people opened their books of history and looked how one becomes the other. Biden said yesterday that he is imposing these economic pains on Russia to avoid World War III. But as he's proceeding, he is about to cause World War III. And he should pay attention if he has any advisors who know something about history. Now, obviously, Mr. Blinken is not one of those advisors, but there are, fortunately, in Washington, one or two who know something about the way the world works. And Mr. Burns, the head of the CIA, is one of them. It would be very helpful if he stepped in.
Well, of course, the position is the White House says Russia's reacting to a threat that doesn't exist. Why does Russia feel so threatened by NATO's expansion, though, over the last few decades?
Well, I'm sorry, this discussion is for the children's sandbox. You don't, either you understand how the world works or you believe in virtual worlds, which is unfortunately what most of American elites are engaged in. They don't want to face the world as it is. And the world as it is, NATO is an offensive bloc that is kept together by hatred for Russia. It would lose its raison d'etre if it should make any accommodation with Russia and create a new security architecture for Europe. These are the sad facts. And so I don't go into a long explanation. There's no need for it. Either you understand that white is white and black is black, or you don't want to face the facts.
There are talks hoped to happen tonight on the Belarus border. The Russian delegation's going there. It's still in Belarus. What hope for any breakthrough, or is it too early?
We'll see. I think it's improbable. Mr. Zelensky himself is reported to have said that he doesn't expect these to succeed. And if anyone knows, he should know. But of course, it's preferable if they talk than they not talk. However, this under no circumstances should hold up the denazification program, which the Russians have as their present objective, and which is guiding their military actions on Ukrainian territory.
OK, we'll leave it there for now. Political analyst Gilbert Doctorow, thank you. We're seeing Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, announcing that the EU, I'm just reading here the quote, will ban Russian media outlets, that's RT and Sputnik, accusing us of spreading harmful disinformation. We try our best to put a balance across. We're licensed by Ofcom in the UK and Europe. They've deemed us to be OK to license. We are, of course, going to put the Russian point of view. What's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with it is that it's totalitarian. You don't suppress media outlets. That's a basic principle. If the EU is going to suppress RT and Sputnik, that means European Union citizens will no longer be able to watch those channels. No one forces them to watch them. It is a measure that she has announced which drastically reduces the liberties of EU citizens. I'm sure it doesn't make a slightest bit of difference to Russia. But it does make a difference to people who want to watch RT and Sputnik. And I mean, we've got used to totalitarianism for 2 years now with all the COVID madness, but this is in the same category. In any case, what laws is she claiming to be operating under? The EU doesn't have that authority. Any more than it has the authority, by the way, as far as I know, to close airspace, as you mentioned in your report.
So we'll come to that in a minute. I mean, I suppose you can still watch us at RT.com on a live section. You can watch the television feed. We'll be broadcasting to most of the rest of the world. But, I mean, how soon do you think this is going to come in? It was expected.
Well, maybe it was, but I am above all, I mean, independently of the issue between Russia and NATO and Ukraine, I think anyone watching this, any European citizen watching this, should be deeply preoccupied by the assault on his own rights, his or her own rights. You mentioned just now in your report from London about the seizure of assets belonging to Russian oligarchs in London. Well, what happened to due process? What happened to property rights? Are we really saying that from one day to the next, somebody's property can be taken away just because they're deemed to be politically close to Russia? This is literally dictatorship. I don't want to sound hysterical, but somebody has to pull the alarm bell on this and say that these kinds of measures undermine the very thing which the British government and other European governments claim to be standing for, namely the rule of law and democracy.
It's an horrific situation from everyone concerned in Ukraine on all sides. The West, though, is talking about wanting peace to try and find diplomatic way forwards. At the same time, we're hearing a raft of new money and new arms coming in there. Is it going to calm things down or make it worse?
Well, there's no sign at all, as you know, of any meaningful political dialogue, because on the contrary, as you've just said, the British and others, the European Union, has promised to send more arms. It was interesting, by the way, that the Americans a day ago, I think yesterday, said they were prepared to take Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, out of the country. That perhaps was in order to prevent him from meeting the Russians, as he is now going to do, or at least his representatives are going to do very soon.
Yeah,
so
I mean, there is a meeting penned, hopefully, for later on this evening on the Belarus border. Do you think it's too soon for anything sensible to be brokered here?
No, I wouldn't say that. My strong hope is that it will lead to some kind of progress. I mean, you know, as you know, and I'm sure your viewers know, Zelensky said, I think 36 hours ago, that he was prepared to meet, even to discuss neutrality. If that were to prove true, then the war could be over, I'm sure, in a very short period. I don't know how he would manage to sell that when he gets back to Kiev, but he said it, and now he seems to be going, or at least sending representatives. So that's a good sign. So but I don't want to predict anything, because
the White House says tonight that Russia is reacting to a threat that doesn't exist.
Well, that's ridiculous. NATO is the most powerful military alliance in the history of humanity. Its expenditure dwarfs that of Russia. Its power dwarfs that of Russia. How can anyone say, after these decades of NATO's wars in Yugoslavia and Libya, that it's not a threat to anyone, particularly when the British Foreign Secretary, Britain is one of the most important NATO powers, seems to imply that Moldova is part of NATO. Moldova is not part of NATO. She also says we have to fight for Ukraine because otherwise we will be threatened. Well, NATO does not have to fight for Ukraine. NATO has to fight for its member states. It doesn't fight for other countries. It fights for its member states. So everyone is losing their heads at the moment. And therefore, it's entirely understandable that Russia should be raising the stakes in this way, because
4 days
NATO
into this hellish situation, final 30 seconds, what do you think is the next step?
Well, as I say, I very much hope that there will be a meeting, whether it is this evening or tomorrow, very soon, and that it will lead to some kind of de-escalation. But right now, I think it would be a very foolish person who would predict anything, because I'm afraid we've entered very, very uncharted waters at the moment, where each piece of news is surprising us.